In this particular video, I'm going to just briefly talk about the self-correcting mechanism in the marketplace. To do that, let's first start with the aggregate demand aspect of it. Aggregate demand is given by this equation. Aggregate demand is equal to consumption by the consumers, investment by the private industry, and spending by the government for building bridges and roads and things like that, as well as the net export. When we talk about the gross domestic product, we only want to be concerned with the products produced in this nation, not the ones that's produced by Germany or France or outsiders. So if we consume their products, such as, let's say, we buy a Mercedes-Benz or Audi or Porsche, and we need to subtract that out, but then we also take into consideration of our products consumed by foreigners. So we take the net export as part of this equation. So this is the fundamental equation that defines the gross domestic product that's produced and consumed here. And that's usually plotted as the gross domestic product, the real GDP versus the CPI. That's the consumer price index for all the products we produce, or at least the ones we consume. So given that, now let's take a look at the aggregate demand curve, which should look very familiar to the ones that you know. Okay, this curve is something that you're pretty familiar with. A demand curve, which has a negative slope. As the price goes up, the demand is less. As the price goes down, the demand is more. So at $120, the aggregate demand in this nation would be for a real GDP of 700. If the consumer price index, the CPI, drops to 100, then the consumption will go up to produce a real GDP of 800. Now let's talk about what would move this demand curve to the left or to the right. Well, it is very similar to the demand curve we see for private industry or an individual firm. Consumers consume more because they expect the future price is going to be higher. So for the same price, instead of consuming this much quantity, they actually consume more quantity because they think the future price is going to go up. So that can shift the aggregate demand curve from 81 to 82. Or they could be more wealthier because they're making more money. More importantly, government can intervene and they can actually change their fiscal policy, which is to tax less and spend more. That would actually make the consumption go up. Or they can change the monetary policy such that the money available is more, so the consumers consume more, private industry invest more, and all that part happens. So the demand curve could shift to 82. This is one mechanism by which we can actually increase the real GDP from here to here by promoting all this aspect. So the government can actually increase the real GDP. An activist economist would like to do this. As we know from our previous chapter that market clearing price is where aggregate supply curve and aggregate demand curve will intersect. Very similar to the industries, private industries, or a particular industry we used to talk about. Now we're talking about the entire nation. There's an aggregate demand for all the products. There's an aggregate supply for all the products. And the market will clear about here. So at any point, at a stable point, the price would be $100 and the real GDP that's produced in the nation is, let's say, 1,000. This is more like 16 trillion for US, but let's call it 1,000 market clearing real GDP at this price. But if the government thought this GDP is too low and there is too much unemployment, the one way to fix the unemployment would be to produce more and employ people to produce it. So they would love to move this aggregate demand curve to the right. Let's call that 82 from 81. They can do that by a couple of things. They can make the consumer consume more, or they can make the investment invest more, or the government itself can spend more, or the net export can go up. These things can be, government is one big player who could actually do this by fiscal policy or monetary policy. Fiscal policy simply is to say tax less so that the consumers have more money, or government itself spend more so that they spend their part of the equation more. And investment community can be incentivized to invest more by changing the monetary policy, reducing the cost of money, and consumers can be incentivized to spend more by leaving more money in their pocket. All this could move this aggregate demand curve to the right. Now the market would probably clear here, according to the activist economist. So the prices would be $120, and the real GDP produced would be, let's call it $1,200. Okay, now the real GDP is up. That means more people are employed. Everything is fixed, according to activists. But hold on a second. Classical economists who believe government should not intervene has an argument. They say this cannot be sustained. Market will self-correct itself back to where it originally started. So government's effort is actually pretty wasteful exercise. That is their argument. Let's see how that works. So this is a picture that shows the self-correcting mechanism of the free market. So let's say the market was here originally. Aggregate demand was 81, aggregate supply was AS1, market was clearing here, and the real GDP was 1,000. And the government believed this is too low a GDP, too much unemployment, so they pushed the aggregate demand curve to 82 from here to here by doing more fiscal policy activities, monetary policy activities, and so on. Now the market is clearing here. At point B, classical economists would say it is possible to supply more real GDP of 1,200 at a higher price, right? It's $110, let's say. And the suppliers will supply more at a higher price because their wages they pay for their laborers does not go up because they are contractually obligated to work for the same money. Similarly, the suppliers who supply raw materials are contracted for a particular price. But over time, when the prices are gone up to 110, laborers will renegotiate the contract and their wages will go up. Supply cost of the raw materials will go up. So essentially the supply curve now costs more, so it will shift to the left. So it will be on a new supply curve AS2. Now we're talking about a aggregate supply curve 2 interacting with a government pushed aggregate demand 2 that ends up clearing at C, because wages and raw materials have been renegotiated. So it is potentially back to the, or presumably back to the same GDP. So at one time at $100 it was producing 1,000. Now at $120 it's producing 1,000. So the real GDP hasn't changed. You can change the demand curve even further. The prices will go up and the real GDP will eventually be back here. So the potential GDP curve, the supply curve basically supplies the same real GDP. So the long run aggregate supply curve is a vertical line. It's a vertical line. And to shift this long run average supply curve to supply more, we have to do other things other than just artificially pushing the demand up. That would be the argument by the classical economists.